When they told me the price for 5694 Morgan Place, I asked what was wrong with it. The house was a huge old Victorian manor, complete with a library, sitting room, drawing rooms, greenhouse, and a garden behind the residence. It sported 8 bedrooms, complete with fireplaces, and 3 bathrooms, complete with showers and facilities. It needed some work, they had made that much clear, but for the price, there had to be some major problems. I would have thought black mold or some sort of parasite, maybe a rodent infestation, maybe the floors were rotten, maybe the roof was bad, maybe the whole house stood in ruin. I didn't know, but I agreed to sign the contract after having it inspected by one of my people. The inspection, to my surprise, came up clean. For a house built at the turn of the century, it's in amazing shape. I didn't see any black mold, no signs of rodent infestation, no bees in the attic, barely any roaches, not even any leaky pipes in the wall. If that's all they're asking for the place, take it and run. So I did just that. As I drove out to the property, I could already see the changes that I would make, the upgrades I would install, the trees I would cut down, the landscaping that I would do. When I was done, this place was going to be a place where people came on vacation, a bed and breakfast that I had always dreamed of owning, and I would spend my time entertaining guests, shopping in the little town of Griffith for antiques, and enjoying the New England countryside. I did a once-through before starting, making note of the things that would need to change, and decided that the wallpaper would definitely be the first thing to go. The rich gold paper, probably once expensive, had gotten slightly damp in the humidity of summer and began to curl up at the corners. There were places where half the paper had come up entirely, leaving a flat brown wall beneath. The carpet would have to go too. There were stiff places, and it was stained all to hell. I had a terrible moment where I thought there might be blood on it, but it turned out to be paint. Whoever had used this place as their art studio hadn't put down tarps, and even the walls had suffered some of it. The rooms were huge, but kind of odd, too. The house was listed as coming with original furnishings, but most of the rooms were very bare bones. There would be an end table, a bed frame, maybe some clothes in the closet, or some junk in the corners. But most of the rooms were nearly empty. I wondered about that until I came to the garden. I found a large pit that someone had used to burn a great many things. It looked as if someone had made quite the bonfire out here, and the earth was still scorched from the blaze. It was going to be a pain to clean all that up, but I'd cross that bridge when I came to it. For now, I was pretty happy with my purchase, and I was eager to get to work. There was a room on the ground floor, a little closet of a space that was probably once a butler's suite, with a little bed and a nightstand in it. The place had electricity, though I'd been told it needed to be updated. This would give me a place to put my supplies and keep my stuff out of the mess. So I unpacked a few things, changed out the sheets, and set to work. After a couple of days of airing the place out and cleaning the kitchen enough to cook in it, I set to work on the house. The foyer was first, the area I meant to turn into the front desk, and I had the wallpaper half removed on the north wall before I saw the corner of a message. It wasn't much, just a few faded red letters, but as more of the wallpaper came down, I saw it was a whole story under there. The letters were easier to read the deeper under the paper I went, and I was soon left with a story left behind by the previous owners of the home. It looked like it had been left in red paint, the kind you could use on a barn, and as the last of the paper fell to the floor, I began to read. To those who find this sad tale, know that you sit in the home of the family Hargrave. For generations, the Hargraves were masters of industry, great composers, philosophers, and the 13th generation was no exception. There were 6 children born to Melissa and Jonathan Hargrave, Jonathan Jr., Marguerite, Venus, Jasper, Persephone, and Carter, your humble writer. Each Hargrave child had their own special talent from the patron of the family Hargrave, and my siblings and I were no exception. John Jr. had an astute mind, No puzzle could thwart him, and no criminal could escape him. Marguerite was given the arts, and her paintings made her wealthy beyond measure. Venus was a great beauty, and she walked the catwalks of Paris and New York. Jasper was a musician, and his music was known far and wide. Persephone was given the natural sciences, and her skills with botany and horticulture made her the talk of the scientific world. Myself, the baby of the family, was given the written word, and I found my skill and trade in writing. Our parents looked upon their brood of protégés and were proud, but there was a catch to these gifts. When the chicks began to leave the nest, they found their talents waned over time. When they returned home, however, those talents returned, and many of us discovered that a vacation to our ancestral home was a must at least once or twice a year. We lived here together often, one big happy family, and the sounds of laughter and song were often heard in the walls of Hargrave. These were the good times, the golden days, but nothing golden is meant to last. The story stretched across all four walls, something I didn't discover right away. I found pieces of it as I stripped down the wallpaper, and the whole story rambled across the walls like a herd of buffalo. This Carter Hargrave had an easy-to-follow style of writing, and it wrapped around the room as if he had written it in one long sentence before dropping down to the next. It was interesting, something I considered leaving up instead of painting over it. Every good bed and breakfast needs a theme, some hook, and this house had been owned by a family of savants. That might be of interest to people, interesting enough to make them come here. I got rid of the wallpaper, taking copious pictures of the story before moving to the carpet. I tore it up, having already decided on tile in here, and got the space ready for laying it. The more I thought about it, the more I decided not to paint the wall. The message would be a good talking point, and I could always paint it later if I changed my mind. I moved on to the dining room, already seeing some faded red letters beneath the curled edges. My mysterious writer had apparently not been taught that the walls were not his notebook, and I shuddered to think what I might find when I went to the room of this artistic sister. Maybe their mother had put up all this wallpaper to hide her brilliant children's masterpieces. As I pushed this one down, however, seeing the wall-to-wall writing, I began to rethink that idea. It all began with my father's death. He had outlived our mother by a year, but their love had been so deep that we were surprised he had made it that long. He had been well into his 40s when he and mother started having children, so the fact that he had seen us grow up and thrive was a miracle in itself. We all returned to the home. As we prepared to bury our father, our mysterious patron made his presence known. We were worried when the man in the top hat arrived that he was a bill collector or a vulture looking for scraps, but he soon made us believe that he was in fact the being our father had always credited with our gifts. He told us all that it was time to choose a new head for the family Hargrave, or our powers would wane and the legacy would be broken. The head of the family must stay within the home, never leaving for more than a day, or the gifts would be gone. This, it seemed, was our father's secret, something mother had not even known, and to keep our gifts, one of us would need to stay here forever. We argued, we quarreled, but in the end, we all decided to go to bed and pick up our conversation in the morning. As I lay in bed, thinking what it would be like to be shackled to this tiny town and this nowhere place forever, someone came to me in dreams. I had never seen our mysterious patron before that night. He was something glimpsed from the corner of your eye as you moved through the house, but he appeared now as the same shadowy figure that had always been drawn on the family altar. Father claimed to have seen him when he was young, and had done his best to render him so we might give him thanks for our gifts. Father's gift had been mathematics and accounting, however, and he had not done him justice. This man, this creature of shadow, appeared as a living shade upon the wall, his height ranging from the ceiling to the baseboard and across the wooden floor of my bedroom. He looked down at me from his prodigious height, and I could almost see the outline of that tall hat he had worn earlier. "Carter," he said, his voice like a scuttling of spiders, "your siblings are plotting to betray the house. They would leave. They don't think their gifts will wane, as I have said, and they mean to let the well run dry. You must stop them. You must change their mind. And if they cannot be changed, you must stop them from leaving. Do this, and I will shine my light upon you." I had no reason to distrust him. This was the man who had given me my ability to write, had showered his love down on my family for generations, and my siblings were getting ready to turn their backs on him. I needed to fix this. I needed to appease his spirit, and I needed to act quickly before they could ruin everything. This was getting pretty good. I wondered if maybe this might turn out to be some sort of tragic house, the kind you could spin into a really good murder mystery tour house. I didn't really believe in ghosts, but I'm open-minded enough to accept they may be a possibility. There were scores of people who would pay big bucks to stay in a haunted house, and I knew that such places could often get away with charging a premium for ambience, and suddenly I was deciding against painting over the words I kept finding. I could have my own little haunted mansion here, and original objects and messages could be a huge selling point. Other than the wallpaper, the room was fairly tidy, and I was already seeing a big table for guests to eat at and ponder the final words of the writer as they ate stew or chicken or whatever the meal for the evening was. They would wonder if the young man was altogether sane, questioning whether this were another one of his books written big, and I moved on to the kitchen with high hopes. The kitchen had been spared from the wallpaper, and was all smooth pale stone and chrome amenities. I had been assured that all the appliances worked, and I was again surprised at the lack of any vandalism or damage to the home. As I cleaned out the cupboards, I didn't find any of the usual rat crap or roach carcasses. I found food in some of them, perfectly preserved food that had expired in the mid-60s. Well, it gave me a timeline to go by at least. If these Hargraves had been the last occupants of the house, then they had left before the end of '64. This was a long time for any place to sit empty. I wasn't complaining, but why had none of the local kids come to break the windows? Why hadn't they come to spray graffiti or used the bedrooms to make out in? Why hadn't they stolen the food from the cabinets as some kind of weird trophy? I didn't get it, but I would, in time. I did some dusting, checked the appliances, and decided to call it a day. As I stood on the back porch at the end of that day, smoking a cigarette and watching the sunset, I thought about how I could get used to this. The sun going down over the garden was something I had never seen before, and as I stubbed my cigarette out and went to start dinner, I was glad I had bought this place. My dream that night was strange, but it wasn't entirely unpleasant. I was walking through the lower floors of the house, taking in the sight of the words as they stretched across the walls in big red letters that whispered their words to me like a quiet ghost. They glowed, the words pulsing with a light like an infected tooth. Their voices rose, the story coming like an angry wind, and as they swirled and blinked, the shadows beneath them began to gather, the room swirling like a whirlwind. I saw my own shadow caught up in that wind. It spun around and around, anchored to my feet by a unavoidable force, before coming to a stop on the wall before me. It fell across the words there, and I could see the figure that Carter Hargrave had spoken of. He was tall, stretching the length of that high wall as it rose to meet the ceiling. His hat was long, a top hat for the ages, and his coat was black as midnight. He brought the tip of his cane down, the clap bouncing off the walls as he glowered down at me like some appraising giant. I was minuscule next to him, a bug before his boot, and when he grinned at me, it looked like a jack-o'-lantern. Well, 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 what do we have here? He bent down, as much as a shadow could bend, and looked at me with merry good humor, something at odds with his earlier appraisal. A new player in our little game. Tell me, would you like to make a deal? I came awake in my narrow bed, shaking and looking around for the source of that monstrous voice. I had been here for less than a day, and it seemed I had met the patron that the story had spoken of. I put it out of my mind as I tried to get back to sleep. It was just a bad dream, just something created from a strange story writ big across my new house, something that had found its way into my dreams. I finally gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen to start some coffee. It was 5 a.m, and as good a time to get to work as any. Who knew what I might find the deeper I went? I found more than I bargained for here. There's a story here, I know it, and I intend to find it. 5694 Morgan Place is a house of secrets, and these secrets might have been the death of someone, or several someones. It was the morning after my dream, and I was interested in finding more of this story. It was early, the sun not even up yet, but I was raring to go. I decided to go back to the room I'd seen the paint splatters in, assuming there must be a story there. Marguerite Hargrave, the artist, would have doubtlessly had quite a story in her brother's little play. First, however, I made myself eat some breakfast. If I've learned anything, it's that you can't remodel a house on an empty stomach. The stove was gas, and it lit fairly easily. I soon had eggs, bacon, and sausage cooking in the pan, toast in a separate pan, they didn't have a toaster, and coffee, of course. I don't think I really tasted any of it, except the coffee, which burned my mouth, but I made myself eat. A full stomach meant I wouldn't have to stop later to fuel up again. The sun was up by the time I got the dishes in the sink, and I went to get ready for the day. I came upstairs 30 minutes later in my painter's overalls and tool belt, ready to get cracking. I should have brought paint, but I was really hoping not to need any. If there was more story beneath the wallpaper in Marguerite's room, then I would leave it for the guests to puzzle over. All in all, I was hoping that the brother would have continued his little tale. Murder mystery houses make the best bed and breakfasts, and usually have the best rates, too. Marguerite's room was the first one off the stairwell to the left. I found the room much as I had before. The carpet in here had been a bad choice. The thick shag carpet in here was caked with paint. Red, yellow, blue, green, so many colors trapped within the thirsty fibers of that floor. It would have to come up, but first, the few bits of furniture would need to go. Thankfully, Marguerite hadn't kept much in here, though I was surprised to see none of her art on the wall. For an artist, she certainly didn't seem to enjoy showing it. I opened the window and unceremoniously tossed out the end table, the lamp, and the few clothes in the closet, and a small desk that I had to break up first. It all fell noisily into the garden down below, and I figured I might make a bonfire out of it later. A part of me wanted to take down the wallpaper right then and there, but I made myself take the carpet up first. It was heavier than I had thought it would be, and I had to cut it to get it out the window. The bottom was as colorful as the top, but some of the stains I saw were decidedly thick. I could honestly believe that some of it was blood, and the flooring beneath was saturated in more than a few spots. It didn't seem to have damaged the wood, though, which was one less thing I would need to fix. With the work done, it was time to get to the main event. The wallpaper came off like it had only been waiting for the opportunity. I felt my heart rate rise as I started seeing words. The same long script as the entryway. He must have used one of the ladders from the library, the kind that rolled along the wall, because there was no way someone could have circled the wall like that without some kind of strange rolling ladder. It wound around and around the wall, stretching on and on until the climax near the baseboards. I smiled as I took it all in, feeling like Indiana Jones uncovering something undiscovered. I moved around the room, glancing at the strange script, and as I did, it was like a movie began to play in my head. I could see the story of Marguerite, from birth to death, and the man narrating it did not sound altogether sane. The longer I listened, the more I wondered how sane I was. This is the final resting place of Marguerite Hargrave. Marguerite was the second of the Hargrave children, beaten by Jonathan Jr. by only a year. Melissa Hargrave was blessed indeed, and Marguerite was not one to hide in her sibling's shadow. Marguerite began painting at the age of 2, though her mother would tell you it was sooner. She would make pictures with her cereal on the lid of her high chair, Melissa would say. She would create art with her milk sometimes, leaving messes for her mother to find later. Even in her messes, though, there was art. The scattering of her toys, the arrangement of her dirty clothes, the spilling of her food from the plate during a tantrum. It was all art. Marguerite, however, would not complete her first piece until she was 2. It was a drawing of the family home, the line work like something from a much older child. Her teacher was speechless, telling Mrs. Hargrave that she had never seen a child do something like this. Mrs. Hargrave thanked her, and that picture hung in the den for the majority of my life, right up until I burned it in the fire with everything else my siblings ever valued. As she grew, Marguerite improved. She was a favorite in the art contests her private school would throw, the winner of many local and abroad art contests, and that was when someone noticed her. Marguerite was 12 when the man from Brathers discovered her. Mr. Thomas, with his fedora and his constant cloud of cigarette smoke, brought her to his studio and displayed everything she ever drew or made. And Marguerite had begun to do more than pictures by then. Marble, clay, granite, charcoal, oil paints, whatever medium she chose, Marguerite could not fail. She told us years later, after Mr. Thomas died, that more had been done than art in that studio. But so what? Is art not to suffer? Must the artist not paint with the brush of trauma from time to time? No one could claim it would be easy, but Marguerite made it all look so easy. Mr. Thomas died when she was 19, a stroke they say, but Marguerite hardly needed him by then. She bought his gallery and displayed her own work, selling a great deal of it and becoming rather wealthy from the endeavor. She traveled, she created, but she always came back to Hargrave House for a little recharge. She always said this was where she did her best work, and this was where she made her masterpiece, her final stroke. Marguerite was not difficult to kill. I only needed to have the right medium. Persephone gave me that element, though I doubt she knew it until it was too late. The plant had a long name that I could not hope to pronounce, but she told me it was a strain of her own creation. It was a natural bug repellent, something that would not harm the plants, but would hurt people in large doses. It would cause a numbing effect if used in small doses, but overexposure could cause respiratory arrest and death. Marguerite had been working on something in her room for days, a series of finger painting experiments that would prove that even a toddler's medium could be art. It was nothing to mix the extract of the plant with her paint, and after working so diligently, the piece became her final gift to the art world. What Persephone forgot to mention was the bleeding. Overexposure did not cause the lungs to stop. It caused them to fill with blood. It caused a bleeding inside the body. It caused the rupturing of blood vessels in the eyes, the bleeding from orifices, and a slow and inevitable death. I found her on the floor of her room, her final masterpiece spotted with her own dying efforts. I shuddered as I finished, the realization that some of those not paint stains were likely from the final efforts of Marguerite Hargrave. How long had she lain here in her own blood? Who else had died when they took away the evidence for inspection? It appeared that whatever was at work here had driven Carter Hargrave quite mad. I could understand. The mystery was driving me a little crazy, too. As I read over the last of it, I became aware that it was nearly 2 in the afternoon. It had taken me less time to clean out the room than it had to read all of that, circling like a bath toy in danger of going down the drain. It hadn't been that long a tale. There was no way I'd been standing here for 4 hours reading it. But I had. I decided to go have some long overdue lunch before perusing more renovations. I figured I probably needed a little break anyway, after what I had just read. Over a lunch of tomato soup and a ham sandwich, I Googled Marguerite Hargrave, just to make sure this wasn't some kind of weird book Carter was writing on the walls. Crazy people propagate weird stories like this sometimes, with fake journals or weird VHS tapes. And it wouldn't be the first time that some rube had found a journal in the wall or a weird recording on a cassette tape and taken it as gospel. The Google search came back with some stories connected to the house, a squib about her birth in 1963, and a whole lot of art. Marguerite Hargrave had indeed been a talented artist, and a lot of her work was still in museums and private galleries. I didn't see anything about her death, though there was some kind of mystery surrounding her disappearance. The mystery of Hargrave House was something that had taken the area by storm at the time, and was still sometimes speculated about in certain chat rooms and forums. I wondered if any of her old artwork was stashed around here somewhere, especially after seeing the price tag on some of them. It was a real toss-up on whether I'd want to sell them or keep them to add to the ambience of the place. I'd have to keep my eyes peeled, I supposed. I had meant to go upstairs and do some more renovating, but instead, I took my tablet up to Marguerite's old room and transcribed Carter's story there. I was a little surprised to see that I'd already written down the one in the entryway, but not overly so. After all, it had been the same voice from my dreams that had suggested I come up here and write it down. Something wants this story told, and I seem to be the one to tell it. Who else will, right? I'm the only one here, so if not me, then who? It was 3 o'clock when I started, and I remember thinking that it wouldn't take that long. It was barely 2 pages after all, and it wasn't as if I was transcribing a novel. I started writing, the story again playing out before me like some movie on a reel, and as I wrote the last of it, I was sitting in a dark, barren room as night hung around me. My watch says it's 9 o'clock, but that's impossible. How did I lose 6 hours? I'm going to bed. This place is strange, but I found myself as invested in the mystery as much as the prospect of turning it into a bed and breakfast. I hope my dreams are quieter tonight. I'm almost afraid to close my eyes and see that otherworldly being again. Afraid, but strangely fascinated as well. I awoke late this morning, my dreams having held on with their teeth. I was walking through the house, not the house I inhabit now, but a house that had once been the home of 8 Hargraves. The entryway was now a receiving room, a communal space with couches and sedan chairs, not a TV to be seen. There were bookshelves, though, great sagging edifices that looked to be in danger of collapsing under the weight of all those books. There was a harp in one corner, as well as a drum set, and every window had a box of growing things. This was a warm place, a place of respite for the family, but there was only one member of that family here. She flitted about like an angry hummingbird, growing and shrinking as she aged and regressed, Marguerite Hargrave had been beautiful, her dark hair existing in a perpetual tale as she walked through her life. One moment she was a gawky girl, doodling on the couch with her tongue between her teeth. The next she was drawing at an easel with the sun coming in behind her. She was climbing the stairs with a canvas, a girl in middle school. Then a taller girl in high school came back down in a paint-covered smock, her body still something she was getting used to. "She was mine," said a voice I was becoming familiar with. "My work of art. It was a shame she chose to turn her back on her patron." I followed her upstairs, a woman on the cusp of striking out on her own, and watched as she changed into a grown woman, returning to her home against her will. I followed her to the same room I had cleaned out, now filled with her things again. The walls were covered in art, the wallpaper all but hidden by the framed works. There was an easel here too, but what was on display was far from artistic. Marguerite lay on the floor of her room, a grown woman in her late 30s or early 40s. As I watched, her head turned back to look at me, her face a bleeding mask of euphoria. "Welcome to the family," she breathed, and I came awake as my heart galloped and my breath puffed like a bellows. One word followed me from sleep, a word whispered across my unconscious mind, like a promise of horrors to come. Venus. Breakfast that morning was toast and peanut butter, my stomach refusing to take much more. I sat there in my paint-covered overalls, still shaking at the thought of that blood-drenched face as it turned back to look at me. It isn't every day that you see a face as full of ecstasy as it is blood, and it would take a long time to get that image out of my mind. It was nearly 10 when I got started today, and I found myself heading to the third room on the left, little as I wanted to. Venus Hargrave did not have wallpaper in her room. The entire room, ceiling included, looked like a dance studio. The floor was wood, the bed one of those heavy sleigh beds that had been denuded of its mattress. That was the only thing that had been left behind, and the walls and the floor made me feel like I was being watched. They were covered with mirrors, and I couldn't imagine what it must have cost to put this together. The walls stretched and warped, picking up the reflection from the other walls, and it gave the place a pursued look. I felt eyes on me wherever I went, and I couldn't understand how anyone could live like this. I supposed that Venus wasn't living like this anymore, but after my dream last night, I doubted it. She was living some sort of life, whatever that entailed, and I knew there was likely to be a new player in my dreams tonight. There was nothing I could do with the sleigh bed, short of chopping it up. I decided to leave it there. I was wondering where today's story might be, up until I saw the tail of a letter poking from beneath the edge of one of the long mirrors. I sighed. I had really wanted to keep the mirrors, but I guess if I was careful, I could get them off the wall without breaking them. They appeared to be hung with screws, so I knew it couldn't be too hard to remove them. The plan lasted all of about 30 minutes, right up until I cracked the first one midway through. Screw it. I could buy more glass. One trip down for gloves, goggles, and my sledgehammer later, and the glass was everywhere. I should have put down tarps, but I didn't. I just smashed and smashed and smashed, and it felt good to take all that reflective surface down. It was like putting out the eyes that had watched me, and I relished it right up until the last swing. My heavy work boots made short work of the glass on the floor, and I soon had it swept up with a heavy work broom and loaded into industrial garbage bags with a shovel. It was past noon by then, and I finished taking down the boards it had been stuck to and found the story for the day. It was written in the same way, sentences that wound around the wall, but I had to wonder how he had done it, when I had so little success with the mirrors. Maybe he had known how they went up and knew the best way to get them back into place. Maybe he had replaced them when he was done. I didn't know. And as I fell into the sad, sordid tale of Venus Hargrave, I found it didn't much matter. Venus Hargrave, second daughter of Melissa and John Hargrave, was born perfect. I say this with no sarcasm, only as a fact. She was studied as an infant for the flawlessness of her form. Her limbs were perfectly proportioned, her arms and legs perfectly symmetrical, her head the perfect circumference, and everything was the exact size and shape it should be. In fact, she was in the top 1 percentile of infants for her proportions. The doctor said at her birth that he had never seen an infant in better health and form. This was the start of Venus's pursuit of perfection, something she would never quite manage to achieve. Venus was a very photogenic baby, as demonstrated by the number of pictures of her around the house. Mother spent most of her time photographing her, dressing her, parading her around the nearby town. She was the belle of the play park, a debutante who still wore diapers, and people complimented her for her whole life, her perfect skin, her perfect hair, her perfect poise. Perfect, perfect, perfect. It was a wonder there was any talent left for the rest of us. Mother never decided that Venus should be in pageants. Venus learned about them at 6 from a friend that she had made at her kindergarten, and insisted that she be allowed to participate. The Hargrave parents allowed it, buying her dresses and lessons she needed to compete, but I believe that she could have gone on stage naked and still won. Venus did not compete in pageants. She dominated them. They were warfare for her, a kind of test of her beauty and grace, and Venus had been properly named for the task. She went through the local pageants, the contests of beauty, and the state and regional challenges, and was finally crowned Miss America. After that, it was only a matter of time before she was signed to one of those great flesh markets that we call modeling agencies, and at 16, she was approached. That's right. Venus was determined to be the most beautiful woman in the country before she could drive. Such things would be enough to turn any girl's head, and Venus was no exception. She had asked her father for the mirrors on her wall when she was 10 years old. Her looking glass was not up to the task, she claimed, and when father asked her why she wanted them on the walls and the ceiling, she told him she needed to see herself from every angle. I would ask for the floors as well, but it would get pretty dirty, she told him, and we laughed. Venus, Vanity might have been a better name for her, thought a little too much of herself. There were always boys coming and going, those who wished to court my sister or just bask in her perfection, but Venus was never one to honor anyone with her glory, but herself. She never married, something my parents always found to be a shame, since it meant her perfection would never be continued. Venus told us once, just before she went to Paris and began modeling for an agency I couldn't pronounce, that she would never have children, not because she didn't want them, but because she was afraid they would outshine her. What if she gave birth to a child every bit as perfect as she had been? They would notice that she was getting older, that her perfection was beginning to wane, and she couldn't have that. Whether it was true or all in her head, who could say? She never married, never had children, but I suppose none of us did. We were all too involved in our own creations to be having children or spouses or anything else that might take up our time. When father died, she was the most beautiful mourner of them all. Her mourning dress looked fresh from a catwalk, her anguish and sorrow a perfect performance for the onlookers. In truth, Venus had never cared for anyone but herself, and it showed when it came time to see who would stay and who would be free to go. She put forth any number of us, myself and Persephone chief among them, But for herself, she had only excuses. She had to return to the catwalk. She was under contract. She was too talented to waste her time here. She must return to the people. Vanity was her sin, but predictability was her downfall. Venus had enjoyed a glass of wine since she was 14. It had started as a dare from our older brother, and every night after, she would have a glass as she threatened to tell our parents that he had forced her to drink it. Soon, we were all having a glass in the evening, but Venus's love of wine had only increased over the years. She would drink in the evenings, something we all knew too well, and it was easy to poison her. I put a hallucinogen in a bottle of wine and left it outside her door. I likely used too much, not caring if the drug killed her or if she tore herself apart. In the end, it was a little of both. She had always loved that room, the one with the mirrors on every wall, the one where even the ceiling smiled for her. But she didn't love it so much after that night. I don't know what she saw in those last moments of life, but it must have been terrible. She locked herself in for the night, and when John Jr. broke down the door after her screams woke us up, it was already too late. She would never see herself again, because she clawed her eyes out and turned them into runners of red that cut her face as surely as her nails had. I think that was when John Jr. really began to get suspicious, but by then, it was already too late. By then, I had plans in motion to be the one to gain all the favor. I would be the one who cut the chaff from the wheat, the one who was worthy of the name Hargrave. It was night when I finished, and I found that I had transcribed it as I knelt before the wall like a worshiper. There were slivers of glass in my knees, small and bothersome things, and I had to pick them out like the quills of a small porcupine. The story is beginning to come together, but I'm afraid of it. Carter Hargrave is either a madman, a murderer, or both. I wonder again how he wrote all those things behind the mirrors, especially when they appeared to have been there for decades. For that matter, how had he put the wallpaper back up without smudging or disturbing the words? Questions, questions, and more questions. That's all I get from this place. I'm exhausted. I'm turning in, no matter what dreams may come. I'm sure there will be more tales to come after a fitful night with the daughters Hargrave. Last night's dream was just as bad as the one before. I walked the familiar halls of Hargrave House, watching the beautiful phantasm as she moved through her life within these halls. Marguerite was there too, her ghost also going about her day-to-day life. But she was joined by Venus as she moved about the living room in this dress or that jumper, descending the stairs for a dance or coming down in a hurry as if to beat someone that I couldn't see. She had lived here, loved here, been loved here, and was now imprisoned here forever. As I stood on the stairs, I could see her and Marguerite sitting in the living room, talking to each other in their funeral finery. "I cannot stay here," Venus said, looking affronted that they would even ask. "My life is in Europe, in Paris, in Germany, on the catwalks, on the streets of Moscow, not in this nowhere place. I cannot stay here. How could you even suggest such a thing?" There was silence for a moment, Venus sitting as she looked at the empty furniture around her. Clearly her family was answering her, ghosts I hadn't met yet, giving their own excuses. Marguerite was by the window, blowing smoke into the air as she looked at something outside, and when she turned back, I heard her raise her voice, and the sound of it made my skin crawl. It reminded me of the voice I had heard from that bleeding corpse in the art studio a couple of nights ago, the one who had welcomed me to the family. "My studio is in New York, V, as you are very aware of. I can no more move my studio out here than you can convince your modeling agency to come to the middle of nowhere." Venus looked at her as she spoke, a look of distaste working its way across her beautiful face. "Those things are terrible for your complexion, Marguerite. You keep smoking like that, and you'll be old before your time." "Not all of us are as worried about our looks as you are, V." "Maybe you should be," she shot back, the image deteriorating, which I took as my cue to move upstairs. I could hear the screaming before I came fully up the grand staircase, and it turned my feet to lead as I came down the hallway. Her feet were heavy too as she ran around the room, screaming as she bumped into those reflective walls. The story had said that John Jr. had needed to kick the door down to get to her, but I found it unlocked when I turned the handle. There she was, huddled in a corner, the blood already running down her face as she tore at her cheeks with her long nails. In the mirror, I saw her own deformed selves as they gathered against the glass. Each of them were her, but their faces, their arms, their legs, their naked bodies were each deformed with growths and tumors. Some of their bulges oozed with pus, and others simply wept with liquid all their own. They clawed at the mirrors, trying to get out, and Venus cowered as she screamed at them to get away. I had to look away when she tore her eyes out, and the scream was so loud I expected to find blood coming out of my ears when I finally shook myself awake. I ate toast again, my stomach still in an uproar. I should be hungry, but I can't find it in me to eat. I haven't showered in 2 days, and I've become able to smell myself. I reek, and it's becoming a problem. I'm afraid to sit on things because I might leave that smell on them. But rather than stop to do laundry and wash, I'm pressing on. I don't know why. I didn't receive any directions this morning, but I want to see Jasper's room today. If John Jr. was the great detective his brother wrote him to be, then he was surely taken out last. So I took a right and went to the second door on the hallway, which led to Jasper's room. Jasper's room was odd. The walls were covered in the same paper I'd found in Marguerite's room and the room downstairs, but there was a foam stuck to it as well to dampen the surfaces from bouncing back sound. Simple foam squares of varying thickness, long strips of tape that had likely held something in place, and even a few sections of metal that had been stuck up with screws and adhesives. Jasper was interested in experimenting with different sounds, it seems. His room was less bare than the others, and that struck me as odd. All the other rooms had been gutted, like the Grinch in Whoville, and this one still had a lot of furniture in it. The bed still had its mattress. There was a nightstand, a desk, posters on the wall, and some hangers I'd thought must be for guitars. The foam on the wall was falling apart, but it was still there, and that made me even more curious. How could he have written beneath the paper in here? There were things on the walls, held on by more than just screws and glue. Those guitar hangers were likely screwed into the stud. There would be no way he could have done it without... I don't know. But as I started peeling back the paper, I could already see the words beneath it. It took some doing, but I got all the screws out of the guitar holders and removed them from the wall. All the furniture was piled in the middle of the floor, another room with hardwood that wouldn't require a lot of decarpeting. With that done, I came to the wallpaper. As it came down, I saw the words beneath it. They were there, spread out in the same spiraling layout that the other three had been in, and I was still as amazed by them as I had been the first time. It was so high on the wall that it seemed like it should be impossible. How would someone do this? He wrote their stories, and then he covered them with wallpaper or mirrors or whatever. Why would he do this? He was gloating, wasn't he? Was he keeping some kind of record, maybe? What was he planning, and why? I didn't know, but I knew where I would get my answers. Jasper Hargrave, the second son of John and Melissa Hargrave. Jasper came into this world to the sound of music, and it created in him a love that lasted his whole life. Jasper searched for music from his earliest days. At least that's what Father always said. Jasper would seek out music within the household, going to the radio or showing excitement when their walks took them past an orchestra or a street performer. He began making his own music at a young age, and Father always spoke of looking up from his paper to find him banging on a toy or testing the sounds they made when struck. Father was amazed by him, and when he showed interest in instruments, Father got him a guitar and lessons and everything that he would need. Jasper started playing his acoustic when he was 5, having to wait until he was big enough to hold it properly. His instructor said that he had never had a student who took to the instrument as quickly and as completely as Jasper. He had to ask our father if he was sure that his 5-year-old had never had a lesson before, because the things he was doing after a week of lessons were unprecedented. Jasper was moved up quickly in lessons, soon growing past what the instructors could teach him. Once he felt that his grasp of the guitar was as good as it could be, he took up other instruments too. Drums, woodwinds, brass, piano, xylophone. There was nothing he couldn't play. Jasper wowed his band teachers, never failing to secure a solo in the seasonal performance the school put on. And he was in multiple smaller bands as well, where he won year after year of the local Battle of the Bands. Music was his life, and it seemed to be all he cared about, all that drove him. He was not a gifted student, but he saw no reason to be. Jasper was someone who would never need school to succeed, and despite our parents' objections, he left home early with his first band. His first, but not his last. Jasper went on tour with multiple bands, playing bass guitar in this band, drums in another, lead guitar in a third, and vocals in another. He wrote music, experimented with sound, and became an innovator in the field. He moved beyond the little boy with the acoustic guitar and became a musical genius a few short years later. He was touring Europe when our father died, and he was the last to arrive at the house, coming in the night before the funeral. He was so different then than the 17-year-old who had left home all those years ago with just his guitar case and a lot of big ideas. He had been home since, but never for long, and never because he wanted to. Jasper came home because otherwise he would have to content himself with being mediocre, and he couldn't stand that. Jasper had to be the best, and I suppose we all did. I always looked forward to his return. Persephone, too. The three of us had always been close, and we had kept in touch after Father and Mother had made their displeasure with him known. Many evenings, when we were still in school, Jasper and Persephone and I, and sometimes Venus, would sit in the gardens and have a drink or two. Jasper would play sometimes, and we would sit under the stars and just exist. When Jasper played, it was easy to forget that you were a genius or a gifted individual. When he played, we were all just people. After the funeral, he acted affronted that we thought he would stay. He was a child of the world, and he could not rob them of his star. He was working with a new method of sound amplification, and as little as I understood about it, I understood it was as volatile as it was ingenious. He was trying to get other musicians to use these new means of amplification, something that would provide a less electronic sound, like you got from a regular speaker, and he was anxious to get back out and onto the scene. He was willing to take a chance of losing his gift, content with the fact that he could live off the residuals of his new invention for the rest of his life. As he had said, though, it was very volatile. It wasn't hard to tamper with his work. The hardest part was catching him out of his room. After Venus, he and John Jr. had become very suspicious of Persephone and I. I think they believed she might be the one killing off her siblings, and who could blame them? I'd been very careful to use things that would make them believe it had been her. The plant compound that killed Marguerite, the hallucinogens that had caused Venus to end her life, and now Jasper's sound device. That one may have been the one to tip my hand, however. John Jr. had seen me sitting and listening to Jasper on several occasions as he talked and talked and talked about this thing. By the time I killed him, I felt like I could have invented one of my own. The problem, as he explained it, was that if the frequency was set too high, it could cause irreparable hearing damage. So I tuned the frequency up, tampered with the wiring so that he wouldn't notice. The noise from his room covered the yelling that followed, but not the gunshot. He barricaded himself inside, yelling and stomping around as he raged at who knows what. I guess it blew his eardrums out. I never had him checked, but the gunshot a few hours later sealed his fate. It was a shame. Jasper and I were always close. He had kept in touch after he left the house, and I had even written a few things for his band when they needed a press release or a pitch write-up. He was the closest thing I ever had to a friend, he and Persephone, but the patron was very clear. If I wanted to keep what the house had given me, they had to pay for their crimes. It was night again when I finished. I'm tired. So tired. This house seems to be taking more than I bargained for. I don't know if I can finish what I meant to do here, but I have to know the end. It's not about my dreams anymore. At this point, I need closure, to know how it ended. I'll update you all tomorrow. I have another ghost story to get to, but I suppose at least it will have a musical accompaniment tonight. The dreams last night were worse than usual. There was no slow growth like I'd witnessed before, and he wasn't like the others. Jasper was strumming in the living room, the blood and brains leaking from the hole in his head. It really ruined the effect of it all. Jasper in the living room with his guitar, Jasper sitting on the stairs with a wood harp, Jasper on the drums in the corner, Jasper fiddling with the tuner as he worked with his bass. Drip, 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 drip. It was heavily disconcerting, but at least I didn't have to get surprised by him with a short trip up to his room. I was upstairs moving through the house as I followed his ghost when I heard someone yelling from the house below. It wasn't a voice I'd ever heard before. This one was deeper, harsher, a cop voice. He was shouting, really losing it, and I came to the railing that overlooked the living room and looked down into what must have been a heated discussion. "I know you two have something to do with it. Fess up. Why'd you kill him? Why Jasper? You've always gotten along the best with Jasper. We all knew that. So why kill him?" Silence. Nothing but silence. And the creak of old wood. "You better talk to me, or so help me God, I'll..." "Leave her alone," said a very familiar voice. It should be familiar. It was the voice that had read all the stories when they played inside my head. She said she didn't do it, so she didn't do it. We all knew that Venus was a drunk, and Jasper had always said he'd rather die than lose his hearing. What about Marguerite, huh? What, are you saying that she made herself bleed out of every orifice? That's not something that just happens. If it's not her, then it's you, and I know you aren't smart enough to pull this off by yourself. They argued loudly, their words running together as they yelled, but Persephone stayed silent. "They kept yelling for most of the night," said a voice to my left. I turned to see Jasper, his head still leaking as he leaned against the banister. "Jasper," I whispered. "They yelled all night, but by then it was too late for any of them. Carter had already decided that he'd kill the rest of them. It was only a matter of time." He looked at me, one eye dark where the bullet had gone through it, and I tried not to look at the wound. "If you want the rest of the story, you'd better go to Persephone's room next. You'll know you're there when you smell the potting soil." I shook awake then, still hearing that dripping as the sun hit my eyes. I was hungry today for a change, and decided to make a big breakfast, like I'd had when I started on the upstairs. Eggs, toast, bacon, sausage, biscuits. I made myself a meal that would have satisfied a crew of working men. I couldn't remember if I'd eaten in the last few days, nothing beyond the toast and peanut butter I'd had for breakfast, and I felt much better once I had a belly full of food. I had already decided I was going to check out Persephone's room today. Well, that's not true. Before the dream, I had been prepared to go to John Jr.'s room, assuming he would be the next target. But after the dream, I supposed I would have to see what role she had played in all of this. I let my overalls have the day off. They were getting a little gross. I put on some flannel and some work jeans as I climbed the stairs to get ready for today's investigation. At this point, the house renovations seemed secondary. This had gone from an HGTV show to an episode of Cold Case Files pretty quick. I went to the last room on the left, the layout seeming to put the kids in descending order in each hall, and opened the door to the wet smell of dead plants. There were planters in the window, hanging pots from the ceiling, and somehow they had put glass in where the roof should be. It meant the room, unlike the others, had a lot of natural light coming in, and I imagined that at night you could lay in bed and look up at the stars. The floor was carpet here too, but not the thick stuff that had been in Marguerite's room. The carpet here was short, springy, and I thought for a second that it might be grass. They had given Venus a mirror floor and found wood that would be acoustically sound for Jasper, so a room with grass didn't seem too far out there. It turned out to be simulated turf, though, and so I began to search. There wasn't much to search, as it turned out. Persephone had lived a pretty Spartan lifestyle. Plants had clearly been her life, and the potting soil I found in the closet attested to that. The paper on the wall was the same as the paper in the other rooms, but after pulling some of it down, I could see that there was nothing behind it. The room had a bed, but it was made up like something in a prison show or a military barracks. There were some books on the shelves, but they looked unopened, if not dusty. The clothes in the closet still had tags on them. Nice tops and trendy skirts, inches from a trough of dirt. I soon began to think that this might not be the room I was looking for. The other rooms had looked like sanctuaries, places where the owners would be at ease and relax. This room didn't feel like that. This room was more like the apartment of a workaholic. It held the things she needed to have, the things that she required, but it wasn't her place. If I was going to learn more, I needed to find Persephone's sanctuary. I checked downstairs, the library, the studies, but none of them felt like where I was supposed to be either. I went to the garden, but it was just beds of soil and the remains of that last fire. If this had been her place, then Carter had burned it down, and there was no story here. I was getting frustrated. Carter clearly wanted the story told as much as his siblings did, so why would they send me on a wild goose chase? That's when I saw it, sitting beneath the trees that would soon take back the garden if they weren't taken care of. It looked like a little guest house, but the green paint and the flowers growing outside it let me know that it was the place I'd been looking for. The door slid open sideways, and inside was what I'd been trying to find. The walls were covered in bookshelves, old weather-beaten tomes on plants and natural sciences. Some of them looked like they'd been written a couple of centuries ago, but I saw a few that looked more modern, unsurprised to see Persephone Hargrave on the spine of them. She'd written texts as well, it seems. And some of them were spread across the work tables, too. The work tables were nothing but planter boxes and rotten equipment. Most of the boxes had become overrun, the plants growing onto the table as they slowly overtook the space. There were mushrooms, flowering plants, hardy-looking mountain roots, and all of them growing here together somehow. The bed in the corner, little more than an army cot with a comforter thrown over it, looked well used, and I realized this place was where Persephone had gone to get away from stress. This was her sanctuary, but I feared it was likely her tomb as well. The tables broke apart angrily as I tipped the shelves over. I knew what I was here for, and it wasn't a lesson in plant life. The words were there, glowing slightly so I could make them out in the dark space. They wound around the walls, just as they always did, and I saw no way that he could have gotten a ladder in here. The place was packed with barely any room to stand, even before I'd toppled the shelves, and I had to guess that he had simply stood and wrote all of this. This must have taken days, weeks even, and the effort to hide them had taken even longer, I was sure. This was unlike anything I could imagine, and as the story spooled out before me, I filled my nose with the smell of soil. Persephone Hargrave, youngest of the Hargrave daughters, was born with a green thumb. I do not mean that she began gardening early. I do not mean that she took to the natural world like a fish to water. She did these things, but it is not my purpose for telling you that she was born with a green thumb. I mean, upon birth, her thumb was green. It was from no disease or mortification. It pained her not at all, even years later, but her thumb was always green. It was the light green of a lime, almost yellow, and the tint stopped at the base and went no further. Our parents took it as a sign and named her Persephone, just as they had done with Venus. Whether by naming convention or by talent, Persephone took to nature like a duck to water. She hated being indoors, much preferring to live outside than in a stuffy house. From the years of 7 to 11, Persephone refused to sleep inside. Our parents tried to entice her to stay in the house, through grass carpet, natural light, and accents in the decor, but she refused to sleep indoors. She kept plants in there instead, and when she was 13, they got her the little house you see here. Until then, she slept in a tent in the garden, or sometimes on a blanket under the stars. Persephone was a talented scientist from the time she was young. She had learned to read almost before she could walk, and she devoured anything about plants and growing things. She took over the garden in the back, causing quite a stir when she yanked up Mother's lilies, but the flowers she grew to replace them were far superior. She seemed to know the perfect way to cross-pollinate, to make new kinds of plants and flowers, and she was soon growing things that no one had ever seen. We didn't know how, no one understood what she was talking about most of the time, but Persephone was doing things that would progress the natural sciences by leaps and bounds. Unfortunately, it appeared that her acumen for science did not translate into anything like social grace. Persephone never made any friends outside the family. People found her strange, and that made them standoffish. She was always in her lab, skipping school and forgetting friendship to work long hours on different breakthroughs. We were sometimes the exception to this rule, and I can remember drinking in the garden with her and Venus and Jasper. John Jr. and Marguerite never really had time for us, and we usually found ourselves grouped together in the garden, sharing a bottle. Persephone was better when she was a little drunk, but it wasn't a state she indulged in often. When the others left, it became just the four of us. Mother, Father, Persephone, and I. Persephone did not often leave, not at first, but as her research became more respected, she spent more time away from the house. She came back more often than anyone else, and I think our relationship was the most stable of any of the other siblings. The two of us were the closest I would call to friends. I still couldn't understand half of what she was talking about, and she struggled to understand the literary arts, but we often shared space together, and I liked Persephone. Soon we became three, and then just the two of us. We were already here when the others arrived, and I assumed that she would just stay here after they left. She had her research, I had my novel, and I had gotten very used to having someone around. So when she said she was leaving for a long trip to the Amazon after Father's death, I was shocked. She couldn't stay, she said. She needed to do this. I was living here anyway. Why couldn't I just stay? She knew that was unfair. I had just signed a book deal. I needed to go on a tour as well, and I needed to leave as much as she did. She was sorry, but she had to put her research first. She had already provided me with the tools I needed to kill the others, though she didn't know it. I had listened to her prattle on about this plant or that plant long enough to know which ones I would use. I also knew that John Jr. would suspect her when it came down to it. I think towards the end she suspected me, but our almost friendship kept her from thinking me capable of such a thing. In comparison, her death was merciful, almost kind. I backed her car up to the shed, blocking the door with it before stuffing the hose underneath. I filled her little shed with smog, killing her in her sleep as she dreamed of an adventure in South America. I didn't like taking that from her, but the patron was very clear on what must be done. After her, that would leave only John Jr. I finished transcribing, unsurprised when I stepped out into the afternoon. I looked up at the house and was even less surprised to see a light on in the room I knew to belong to John Jr. I won't be sleeping tonight. I'm going up there to get my answers. This house has played enough games with me for a lifetime. As I went through the house, I realized the dreams had been unnecessary. Coming in through the back, I was greeted by the ghosts of the Hargrave clan. Persephone and Jasper cooking in the kitchen, Marguerite doing dishes as she hummed to herself, Venus reading a magazine at the table, a tall woman in a long dress who moved about the kitchen like a friendly wind. Those were the good times, the children young, their lives uncomplicated. There were other voices there as well, a less deep version of the cop voice that I associated with John Jr., and a lower voice I associated with the narrator of the stories. Moving into the living room, I saw them going about their lives as they relaxed in the shadow of their family. Venus holding up a dress to make sure it fit right, standing beside a younger version of herself as she put a similar dress on a doll. Jasper on the drums, a kid of no more than 8, accompanying him on guitar. He was no longer the leaking phantom I had seen before, and he looked better whole, as his eyes sparkled with mirth. Marguerite sat sketching at the table, as not far off an older version stood painting by the window. By the window, a baby Persephone looked longingly out into the yard, just looking for an escape from her cage. Outside, Persephone worked at a box of flowers, looking in on occasions, as if she could see the baby she had been, right behind the glass. They were gathered here now, the house their prison and their home, but I could feel a fifth waiting to be added to the cast. I mounted the stairs, feeling the chilly presence of the spirits as they passed through me. Kids racing down to breakfast, teens heading down for school, adults heading to a funeral as they prepared to leave this place for the last time, scattered to the wind like dandelion fluff. Why was I still here? I thought. I wasn't trapped. I could leave any time I wanted. Why did I choose to let this place keep me? Curiosity is like a chain, someone had said. The stronger the pull, the tighter the collar. That seemed apt, but I couldn't stop myself from being dragged by my own need to know. I turned to the first door on the right, and it opened with a warm groan of old wood. This was no horror movie tomb. This was the front door to the home of a well-loved relation, the sound welcoming, inviting, and I expected to see a fire within and smell tea brewing. John Jr.'s was the most intact room I had seen in the entire house. The interior was a mess of moldering papers, ancient books, and mildew, but Carter seemed to have taken nothing from it. It looked the way I imagined Sherlock Holmes's study would look, a perfect combination of seemingly orderless clutter and anal retentive destruction. The walls seemed to be made of corkboard, and they had pens and paper across them, as John Jr. tried to piece together suspects from the evidence he had available. There were towering shelves of books, a roll-top desk, a small single bed, and on the low table in the middle, I found an honest-to-God pipe sitting on a stand. I sighed, knowing already what had to be done. The shelves went over pretty easily, but the cork boards were screwed in tight. They did not want to come off the wall. They fought me, screw and nail. Power drill or not, my fingers were hurting and bloody by the time I got them down, and when I threw them in the middle of the room, the walls were finally bare, and I stared at the paper. By now, it was like unwrapping a Christmas present, and as the last of it came off, I looked upon the words that I'd been waiting to find. I looked upon the last message of the Hargrave murders, and read Carter's final declaration. John Jr. was dead before Marguerite. He just didn't know it. John Jr. Hargrave, eldest of the Hargrave children, was 6 by the time I was born. He was a joyless child, but he had been raised by a banker, so what did we expect? My earliest memories of him was of this dour 6-year-old standing over my crib, looking down at me and saying nothing. It feels odd to realize that someone so young has such disdain for you before you've even seen a year, but that was John Jr. Father always said that Junior had a mind for puzzles. Sudoku, crosswords, riddles, he loved them all. Above all else, though, he adored the tales of Sherlock Holmes. Mother had a framed photo of him from Halloween when he was 4 or 5, strutting about in his cloak and deerstalker hat, a magnifying glass to his eye. My brother was a detective before he even fully grasped what one was. Everything was a mystery or a case to him, and he loved finding the things that no one else could. The case of the missing hairbrush, the mystery of the lost textbook, the case of the muddy footprints. John Jr. solved them all, but he couldn't see his own murderer at work. He graduated high school and went straight into police work. He graduated from the academy with honors, but the Griffin Police Department was too humble for someone like Jonathan Hargrave, Jr. He spent his evenings studying, preparing his body, steadying his hand, and was sued on to the FBI training facility at Quantico. After 4 years within the cocoon of excellence, and a lot of recommendations from his instructors, John was ready for the big cases. Jonathan Hargrave, the man who thwarted the Louisiana diamond smugglers, who discovered the secret code in the gloating letters of the beachside killer, the man who discovered the communist commune in the hills of California. He worked with Scotland Yard, with Interpol, traveled the world, but it was never enough. What John Jr. wanted more than anything was a nemesis, a Moriarty for his Holmes, but this was the real world. People do not act against you without a damn good reason, and John felt his victories were hollow. He was fighting against drug smugglers and kidnappers, the dock workers of the crime world. He wanted a challenge. He wanted a real test of his mettle, and so he got it. He got exactly what he wanted, but it proved to be more than he bargained for. When Father died, he was the first to make excuses about why he must leave. He had to return to Washington. He was needed. He had to get back, or how else would they solve all the cases that had piled up? It was unfair of us to expect him to stay. Let one of the younger ones sacrifice themselves. He was too important, too valuable to be trapped here, and he really couldn't stay longer than the week it would take to recharge. I think, even then, as I sat quietly across from him at the table, I had already decided to kill him. Our patron provided the excuse, but I'd wanted him dead for years. In truth, he should have died before Marguerite. John Jr. was a lover of expensive tobacco. I think he thought it made him more Holmes-like, and he smoked pipes often, even though Mother had hated the habit. I had taken his tobacco and added a little something special before returning it. Persephone had gone on and on about the seeds of one of her new plants, and how burning them could cause a peaceful haze in a person. I had tried it myself and found them quite soothing, but she warned that burning more than a few at a time could cause respiratory arrest. You would have something similar to an asthma attack, but nothing short of a tracheotomy would save you. Your throat would spasm, unable to take in air, and that would be that. I'd loaded the tin with seeds, ensuring that any pipeful would kill him. But somehow, he survived. I can't explain it. Perhaps it was sheer determination, but after Marguerite died, he was intent on finding her killer. I saw it on his face when he kicked her door open, looking upon the sibling he had always gotten along with the most, his second in command when it came to minding his youngers. I knew he felt alone. More than that, though, he knew he had a case to sink his teeth into, and I knew there was no better way to keep him here. He would stay until the case was solved, or my poison did for him. Either way, he would die here. After that, every night was a game of Clue. Who had done it? How had they done it? Why had they done it? He brought us all into the living room, explaining that Marguerite had been murdered. He laid out how it might have been done. He wanted our alibis, all of them pretty easy to prove or disprove, and none of them putting us in a position to have acted against her. I didn't even have to lie. When my older sister died, I was in the kitchen with Jasper and Persephone, drinking and positioning myself where others could see me. It went rather quickly after that. Venus went next, then Jasper, and each new death drove him deeper into madness. I thought each night would be his last. You could smell his damn pipe smoke throughout the house, but every morning he rose, coughing and sputtering, but still moving. I remember the night he accused Persephone, the way he told me I wasn't smart enough to pull off something like this. I almost laughed in his face as it got redder and redder. I could already tell he was having trouble breathing. His breath labored as he laid out his accusation. I hadn't killed him, not all at once, but it was slowly overtaking him. I expected he'd be dead by morning, but I couldn't wait that long. I left him smoking like a chimney and went to take care of Persephone. When I came back inside, the deed done, there he was at the top of the stairs. He was laughing, the sound of it like someone with tuberculosis, and he was bent double as he tried to get it up. He looked very precarious at the top of those stairs, and I wondered if gravity would do what I could not. I know, I know it was you. I should have seen it from the start. You, and I wasn't sure I would hear it all before his throat closed, but he soldiered on. You poisoned them, made it look like Persephone. It was you the whole time, right? Right under, right? But that was his final word on the matter. John Jr. pitched forward, drawing in a final rattling breath before he did so, and plummeted down the stairs. I don't know if he broke his neck or just couldn't get air, but he was dead when he hit the ground. So fell the house of Hargrave, with only the youngest son to bear witness. I was alone, the will of my patron fulfilled, and now I was free to seek his favor. I sighed as I finished the dark telling, wishing they had saved some of that wine for me. I felt like a drink would have done me good. I knew where I needed to go. It was 2 doors down, but I didn't feel capable of making such a trip at that moment. He had done it. He had killed all of them. And here was his confession, writ large for all to see. I would not call Carter a likable character, but he was certainly the protagonist of this house of shadows. I searched through the mess and was rewarded with a silver flask in the roll top. The whiskey that lay inside was bitter and strong, but it took the edge off. I sat on John Jr.'s small bed and tipped more of the whiskey into my mouth. I didn't care if it was poisoned. This house had put enough of its poison into me, and I felt like a little more might be just what I needed. My watch told me it was midnight, and when I heard the tolling of a phantom grandfather clock, it felt like the ghosts within the house were becoming lively again. I got up, knowing where I needed to go while my spirits were still risen. There was only one ghost left to wake up, the ghost of my mysterious tour guide in this haunted mansion of secrets. I held no illusion that he would provide any answers. I held nothing but dread for what I must uncover at the end of this long road. I stood outside Carter's room for a long time before I found the strength to reach for the door. Downstairs, it sounded like a small army was going about its day. The voice of John Jr. had joined the chorus in earnest, and the house was suddenly full of noisy ghosts. It was like listening to a half a dozen VHS tapes at once from all periods of someone's life. There was the eager squeal of kids running downstairs for Christmas morning, the general laughter as games and ideas were exchanged, music, song, arguments, fights, forgiveness, the sound of a large family coming together and moving within the same waters. I'd always wanted that, always wanted a big family and an active support system. I had one brother. He had died a few years ago in a car crash. Our parents had always been career-minded, things like children being almost an afterthought, and when Gabriel died, it had felt like I was alone in the world. I suppose I'd learned well from my parents. I'd never sought out a wife, never even thought about kids. Now I was here, planning to open a place for families so I could live vicariously through them. Was I any better than them? I opened the door before I could think better of it. Carter's room would have nearly qualified as a second library. There were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, complete with ladders that rolled on casters between them. He had so many books I'd never even heard of, and tossed casually around the room were comfortable little things to sit on and read. Pressed against one tall shelf was a small Spartan bed that looked barely wide enough for one. He had no posters, no models hanging from the ceiling, nothing to signify his interests except... No, that wasn't quite true. Carter didn't need posters or models or anything a normal person might use to show others their great loves. The books were his love, his life, and through them he had lived 1,000 lifetimes and loved 1,000 loves. The only space in the room not dominated by huge shelves was a desk by the window, and atop it was a battered old typewriter and a huge stack of paper. The paper was yellow, curled at the edges some, but still serviceable. I hated to tear down the bookcases, but I was saved the trouble. No sooner had I set my crowbar behind the first shelf than I heard a plaintive, almost pleading ding from the typewriter. I looked up to see a fresh sheet of paper in the guts of the thing, the keys clicking away as it filled the space with words. It dinged again as it finished, spitting out the page as something fed a fresh one into the machine. It was already typing away before the page hit the floor next to my foot, and I picked it up to find the start of what I had been looking for. To whom it may concern, I hope I've caught your attention before you've begun destroying my sanctuary. It's funny, I had you wreck the spaces my siblings loved so much, but when my turn came, I proved just how much of a coward I am. In the end, I couldn't stand to see my own place of refuge torn to pieces, and if that makes me weak, then I suppose I am. If you've come this far, then I suppose you're hoping for an end to this story. If those are your reasons, then I may have to disappoint you. If If you were hoping for some kind of closure, then your disappointment will be complete indeed. If you've come to learn how my story ends, then you may get what you want, though it may not be what you came to find. I looked at the desk and found 3 to 4 sheets of paper sitting in a pile. I put the sheet I had back in the stack and grabbed the top sheet. You read the final tale from Carter Hargrave, youngest of the Hargrave children, and the last of the Hargrave line. I was the one who ended that family line. It was I who brought the gifted family Hargrave to its knees. I was no accident. All of our births were acts of planning by our parents, and I came forth into the world with a story to tell. I remember everything that ever happened, from the moment I came into this world until I stepped over my brother's body and went to meet my patron. I was gifted, or cursed, with perfect memory, and it has aided me greatly in my pursuits of the written word. I wrote stories in my crib about my bears or my balls and the adventures they undertook as they crossed the landscape of my blanket. Babies do not write like people do. Their stories are transient, less cohesive, and I did not yet understand things like walking or the world at large. Sometimes Mother would sit me in the swing and let me look outside, and I would see the trees and the grass, the flowers in the garden, even the car as it hunkered before the house like a faithful dog. I remember all these things, but they don't mean much. What stands out are my siblings and the things we used to do. John Jr. and I have never seen eye to eye. How could we? By the time I could speak, he was nearly out of elementary school. When I began writing in earnest, he was going into high school. The gulf that divided us was vast, and he made no effort to build a bridge. Marguerite, however, was someone I often thought of as a second mother. Marguerite, who, whether out of obligation or desire, often joined in our games. There were evenings she would help us with projects, put on plays that I had written and she had made the backgrounds for, accompanied by Jasper on his guitar, judged our games of charades and Pictionary, and so many other things. Evenings in the Hargrave house were far from boring, and certainly never quiet. I remember when I was 8, we performed Shakespeare for Mother and Father in the living room. John Jr. sat amongst them like he was too good to come and perform with us. Not until we performed The Hound of the Baskervilles and let him play Holmes himself. Jasper, Persephone, Venus, even Marguerite put on a fine performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and as we took a bow, I remember wishing these days would never end. I missed the times I would bask in the laughter and the adulation of my siblings, my friends. But what's the line from Frost? Nothing gold may stay. Such was the case for us as well. John Jr. left first, off to pursue his desires to solve cases and catch the unjust. Then Marguerite, as she left to paint and create. Soon it was just Venus, Jasper, Persephone, and I, drinking in the garden by night and wondering who would be the next to go. Venus intended to make it her, but Jasper beat her by a month when he left in the night to chase his musical endeavors. Venus left not long after, and it was just Persephone, Mother, Father, and I. Persephone saw no reason to go for longer than a few days, a trip here or a lecture here, and I saw no reason to leave either. I had been published 3 times before I left high school, and as I settled into my life as an accomplished writer, I reveled in the written word. The more I reveled, though, the harder it became. The masses do not want innovation. The masses do not want to read untested ground. The masses want clean, comfortable stories, a treading of that same ground, and I soon grew bored with the desires of the public. They do not like when I turn from comfortable ground, and when I walk the same paths again and again, they often compare it unfavorably to my other works. My siblings were innovators. They were changing the world, and I was doing little but reading the same written word again and again, like an animal in a circus. I suppose I was jealous of them in many ways, and that was how my spiral began. I fell into drinking fairly easily. Alcohol is the crutch of many great writers. Twain, Dostoevsky, even Frost, some say. Father's liquor cabinet had never been dry a day in my life, and I was soon banging away at my work while drunk as a lord. I never indulged in anything harder, though I knew Jasper had access to it. I would drink, but I never wanted to lose control of myself completely. My work was important, and I had to keep writing, or what was it all for? The writing was a mania in me, a need to squeeze as much as I could from it, and I sometimes wondered if it was the same with my siblings. Persephone described it as a buildup of knowledge, and she said it sometimes hurt if she tried to go too long without working. Jasper said it was more like a knowing that if he didn't sharpen his craft it would begin to dull, and Venus said it was an anxious feeling, that she would be forgotten. It sometimes kept her up at night. I never asked the other two. Perhaps I should have. Regardless, you know how it goes from here. It had been nearly a decade since Venus had left when Father died. Mother had gone the year before, and her passing had hit us all deeply. Father was the breadwinner, the one who kept us all fed and clothed and in the finest schools, but Mother was the heart of the family. Mother had kept the house, she kept us, and she was often a part of our games as well. We came to Father with matters financial and professional, but we went to Mother with boo-boos and broken hearts and family squabbles. The mood around the house was far sadder than it was for Father's funeral, and it was like something had died in us all. We didn't stay as close as we had been, the ones of us who were, and it felt like we had lost something irreplaceable. When the man arrived during Father's wake, it was the beginning of the end for us. I had recently written a bestseller, something I hadn't done in years, and I was set to go on a book tour when I got the news. Father had passed in his sleep. He was very old, and I told my agent to put it off until June so I could mourn. Honestly, I just wanted to see which of us would get the house. John Jr., of course, would inherit most of the estates, but I didn't want to come back from my tour and find that I suddenly had nowhere to live. And so the man in the tall hat intruded on our grief and told us how our abilities would diminish if we didn't choose someone to stay. Father had been the anchor, something he had never told us about, and now there would need to be another. Thus began the debates. John Jr. had his life in Washington. Marguerite had her studio in New York. Jasper and Venus had the world. Persephone had the Amazon. And I had my book tour. I could no more stay than any of them, though they seemed to think I was the obvious choice. "You live here full-time already," John said. "Your life is already here," Jasper chimed in. "You have no desire to leave," Marguerite said. "Where else would you go?" Venus stated bluntly. I looked to Persephone, the closest of my siblings, but she said nothing. That hurt the most. Why should it be me, though? Did I not have my own life? Did I not have my own dreams? Why were my goals so much easier to achieve from home than theirs? It was unfair to hang this on me, and when I told them so, they looked at me as if I were the most selfish person alive. "Then there is no anchor," John Jr. stated. "If none will stay, then it's over." I was shocked. Just like that. They would throw it all away for their own pursuits. They would turn their backs on our legacy for what? Mediocrity? I left to be by myself as they tore at each other like a pack of jackals. Gone were the smiling faces that had once decorated the living room. The knives had come out, and we were a pack of strangers. Perhaps the smiles had been masks this whole time, and they had really been strangers all along. We would lose our gifts, and they seemed content with that. Not me, though. I would not stoop to mediocrity. Perhaps that was why he chose me. He came to me in the night and told me that if I was to keep my gift, if I was to have my heart's desire, I would have to keep them here instead. They would be the anchor, all of them, and I would have what I wanted. So, I did his bidding, but I was as blind as the rest of them. Perhaps John Jr. would have seen through his charade, but not I. After I was done burning the things they prized the most, I stepped over my eldest brother as he lay at the foot of the stairs. I practically skipped up those stairs to tell my patron what I had accomplished. I went to him, my desire in mind, and he called me his avatar and asked what my fondest wish would be. I told him I wanted to be the greatest writer of my age. I wanted to write a tale that would stand the test of time, a story so sensational that no one would ever see its like again. And he gave me exactly what I wanted. Now this home is my prison too, my last great work. He wrote my story on the walls, beneath all the frou-frou we had hung up to hide the bare and ugly truth, and he wrote it large for all to see. Here lies Carter Hargrave, the fool of the Hargrave clan and its biographer. I wrote this story with my actions, with my haste, and now I have eternity to regret. I put down the last page, the typewriter having long ago stopped tapping away. I'm sitting on the bed in Carter's room, still not sure what to make of it. What do I do with this information? What do I do with this house? The more I learn about this place, the less I want to be here, let alone invite people here. If the house could trap the Hargraves here, how many more might it snare? How many more are already here? And even as I sit, there is a voice that whispers to me, "You can be the last Hargrave. It doesn't matter what you were born as. You can be Hargrave. Take up the mantle, open the house, fill it with more children to continue my legacy. Let me give my gifts to you." It's beginning to sound pretty good, but I know the cup he offers is full of poison. As I rose from the bed, I knew what I had to do. I didn't knock down his bookshelves, but I did destroy Carter's sanctuary, as he had the others. The fire licked from the lighter to the paper on his desk, and the flames chewed at the old books, devouring them and spreading across the dry old house. I didn't look back. I knew the house was just waiting to be devoured. It had only needed a nudge. I walked down the stairs, seeing the ghosts below begin to dissolve into shimmers of agitated light. They were free now, even Carter, and he could go and do what he wanted. The adults, the 6 that stood watching as I left, seemed relieved. They were holding hands, watching me with a mixture of relief and finality, and the one on the end mouthed a quick thank you before they all dissolved into nothing. I left everything behind as I walked out onto the lawn, the heat like a furnace behind me. That was where the fire trucks found me an hour later. By then it was too late. The house was gone, little more than a pile of kindling and ashes. I told them I had gotten out before the fire got too bad, not mentioning that I had started it. The insurance paid me out for what I had spent on it, and I decided to look for something a little newer for my bed and breakfast. Perhaps something with a few less ghosts.